Thousands of Americans have yet to mail in their absentee ballots. Do not panic. Your vote can still count. If your ballot missed the October 27th deadline to have it received by Election Day, voters can drop off their ballots at a local polling station. But with the U.S. Postal Office reporting widespread delivery delays, there are concerns non-postmarked ballots won't be counted. Meanwhile, in Texas, a judge will hear an emergency case later today from Republicans looking to toss out all votes cast at the drive-through polling locations. The GOP argues the state prohibits all drive-through voting. The Texas Supreme Court has already ruled against Republicans looking to toss nearly 127,000 votes in Harris County. And I spoke to the Brennan Center for Justice's Voting Rights and Elections Program Director, Myrna Perez, earlier on CBSN AM, about why the postmarks are not necessarily the most accurate way to track votes. Here's what she had to say.
We have millions of Americans that are already voting. Americans have a lot of options, and our elections are really, really important. So this is like every other important thing that we need to be prepared for different kinds of contingencies. So people need to be ready for the kinds of things that may go wrong. People need to double check things just because it's something that matters. But I think Americans shouldn't be very worried. We should be very prepared. But I will say that postmarks come up because there are about half the states that allow ballots that have been timely mailed. So that means they've either been mailed on or before Election Day, according to state law, to count even if they arrive a few days after Election Day. This is a pro-voter convenience that is takes into account that voters want till the last possible moment to be able to make an important decision. Maybe there's some late-breaking news that will impact how it is that they're deciding, and they can't really control how the post office works. So postmarks are one of the ways in which states check to see that somebody put their ballot in on time. But there are going to be glitches in that, as there are glitches in many other systems. For example, sometimes the mail is stuck together when it's trying to go through the machine, so not every single one of them gets a postmark. Or sometimes because it's on a prepaid envelope, a postal worker may not know that it needs to be stamped. And so that's the worry. The worry is that there will be some envelopes that have not been stamped as a postmark that are otherwise permitted in states if they arrive a few days after elections. And what we would say is that there are some states that account for that. There are about 10 states that account for the fact that not all ballots will have postmarks. And you can look at things like their ballot tracking, because the mail ballots will have barcodes and the like on them, so election administrators can see when it got put in the polls. You could also look to see when the voter signed it. The most important thing is for people to not not fall into the cynical statements of partisans that may be saying that these ballots are illegally cast. There are a lot of people out there that I think are trying to cast doubt on our elections. And just because the post office did something wrong or because the post office took a little bit of time doesn't mean that those voters were trying to cheat the system. And I think we as Americans should not tolerate politicians accusing other voters of doing something improper when we all know that we're having trouble with the post office right now.
Indeed. You mentioned that there are some states that are kind of account for these occasional hiccups in the system, that maybe a ballot might not get a postmark. How are they doing that? Is it sort of giving these ballots a little more time to get to their destination?
No, they look at some of the other things that we were talking that I mentioned earlier. So they look at when it was signed. They look at the tracking to see when it went through the system. I mean, obviously, we want to make sure that people are casting their ballot on time. The big question is the gap between when it was cast and when it was arrived. So they're not giving some of those states. Certainly, this only matters in states, and there's about half of them that allow ballots to come in, that allow ballots to arrive if they have been timely mailed after Election Day.
So you mentioned that, one of the things that you don't want to see us do is sort of give in to this partisan politics, these accusations that, that there's fraud, that this sort of voting is sort of rife with fraud. There have been a number of lawsuits across the country, many of them as a result of Republicans trying to challenge votes, whether it's, votes that are arriving late, or we just talked about in Texas, the drop-off boxes. Can you talk a little bit about your concerns when it comes to some of these lawsuits and the ways in which, people may be disenfranchised?
Sure. This has been the most heavily litigated election season that I have ever seen, that I think in history. The Brennan Center, are tracking almost 300 cases right now that are going through the system. These election cases followed a few phases. Like in the beginning, most of the lawsuits were being brought by pro-voter organizations and groups that wanted to expand access in the time of a global pandemic, where our usual ways of doing things weren't working for us, and where more people were going to be voting by mail. So all of the hiccups and glitches in our vote by mail system were going to have a much bigger impact and be dealt with on a much bigger scale. And then we started seeing a wave of pushback on those victories that had been achieved, either through legislation, through gubernatorial executive order, through court systems, through settlements. We started seeing pushbacks on those. And now we're at a new phase, which I think is really, really frustrating and highly dangerous, where we are seeing partisan groups, political parties, go in and actually challenge voters. They're not even trying to change the rules of the game so that some ballots can count and some ballots can't. They're actually trying to segment certain voters and saying that these votes can't count. And this is like an example in Harris County, where we have already had the Texas Supreme Court say now twice, that it is permissible for people to vote using a drive-through mail system. There's still now a federal challenge, a challenge in federal court, to try and say that anybody that used those vote-by-mail systems, those ballots need to get thrown out. We're seeing similar things happening in Pennsylvania, in which the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court has already said that as long as they mail the ballot on time, if it arrives within 3 days, it can be counted. There's now an additional lawsuit to try and get those ballots thrown out. So I think we need to be asking, as Americans, like, do we want our politicians going after our votes like this? I mean, it's one thing to be disputing what the rules are like, and how accessible should we be, how accessible we shouldn't be. And I think most Americans want our elections to be free, fair, and as accessible as possible. But this is like a next phase and a next level where they're actually trying to get ballots not counted, because, and in some circumstances, certainly in Pennsylvania and Texas, when we've already had a court, and in some cases multiple courts, say that that was an appropriate way for people to be voting.
So, the thing about these lawsuits is there are appeals, or at least the threat of appeals, no matter what the court has concluded. Now, I can't recall exactly which governor. I think it's Pennsylvania, but it could be wrong, has actually said, mail-in ballots, count them, but put them aside for potential disqualification, because we don't know what's going to happen down the road. So with that in mind, I mean, when can we expect a winner to actually be declared in this election?
It's funny, the political pundits are all mapping out a bunch of different scenarios as to when we can expect the rules. I mean, obviously, it depends upon how decisive the victory is and in what states and how many electoral votes is that decisive victory in. So certainly there's some scenarios in which we can expect to find out on Election Day. But I think Americans should be prepared for the fact that we might not know on Tuesday night or the wee hours of Tuesday or Wednesday morning, and those don't have to be for bad reasons, right? Like, I mean, if we want voters to be able to have the last possible moment to be able to cast their ballots, as again, that they're allowed in about 23 states, then we have to wait for those ballots to come in. if we want voters to have the opportunity to be able to correct technical defects, then those voters need to be informed, and then they need to have a chance to come in and fix whatever was the issue with their earlier cast ballot. And if we want our elections to be, if we want to be confident that there were no cyber criminals attacking any of our machinery, those elections want to be audited. And that also takes time. So I think we've gotten a bit spoiled in this country by expecting results on election night when there's a bunch of very pro-voter reasons, a bunch of very sensible reasons why it may take a little bit of time to find out. And I would just encourage Americans to do a few things. One, be patient. Two, make it clear to your politicians that you don't want them monkeying around. This is our elections in which we are getting to set the direction of the country. This is not a job security plan for them. And three, to not be deterred from voting. I do think that all of these big talks about fraud and a lot of these lawsuits are designed to fatigue Americans on a time where we are already fatigued because we are dealing with a once-in-a-century pandemic. We cannot let them win. We cannot let them win. They are trying to make us tired. They are trying to make us think that our vote doesn't matter. They're trying to discourage us from voting because they think that the system, doesn't work for us. And I think the best way we can discourage people from doing that is by going in and voting them and saying in one clear voice that we care about our right to vote.
I mean, I love the fact that you said that they are trying to make us fatigued. I started the show off talking about how 2020 has probably felt like a marathon to many people. And if anyone's ever run a marathon, which I have never, I will underline that, it is the last bit of the race is when you dig deep and you get that last bit of energy that you have to make it across the finish line. And essentially that's what you're asking, the voters to do too. Don't get bogged down. Don't get exhausted. This is your right. Let your voice be heard. And some things are worth the wait, and we will ultimately have an accurate count and know who the next president is. Just give it a little time. Myrna Perez, thanks a lot for the time that you spent with us.
Thank you so much for having me.